It's time that you knew there's someone there who's searching for you, and it's time that you believe he's gonna find you.
Why, hello everyone. Welcome to Two Guys Fixing the World. And who are these two guys? Well, my name's Mark Stallard, and of course my good friend is with me, Ryan Jans. How you doing, Ryan?
Doing great, Mark. How are you doing tonight?
I am doing well. We had a couple of hiccups, but then that's every time we do a show, regardless live or recorded, we have some hiccups. Today, actually, we're going to be talking about minimum wage. It's going to go a little bit into a little more depth, I think, than just the pros and cons, or the fors and against, I should say. We're going to go quite deep and over several episodes, I believe. So we'll see how the conversation goes. But first, wherever you are, you can catch us on your favorite podcast provider, whoever that may be. I think we're pretty much everywhere. You can catch us on YouTube as well. This podcast will be put up pretty much right away as soon as we've as soon as it is on the podcast platforms. It'll be up on YouTube, and because you can catch links to everything on fixingtheworld.ca. I'll have all links and details for the show on the website, as well as on YouTube. So like, subscribe, share, or whatever you fancy kids are doing these days on your YouTube, or your YouTube and the podcast station-y things.
Yep, we'd really appreciate a shout out. And if you are young and you're wanting to get more involved, or if you're curious about politics, welcome to the show. If you're a bunch of crusty old salts like the two of us are, welcome to the show. There is a place for everyone here. So we're glad that you could join us and let us share in your day whenever or wherever that is taking place.
Yeah, and I think that we kind of this is one of the first topics we talked about on our young podcast. And it's something that we're both experienced in being reciprocant of, or not, as the case may be. And we're both now musicians in a band called It's All in the Mind, and we also have to do our day jobs because we don't make enough money playing the music. So we're poor musicians as well, even though we're sort of professionals in our careers, which we'll probably get into in a bit, I imagine. So the whole idea of minimum wage. Crazy insanity, or absolutely ludicrous that we have to talk about it at all?
Indeed. There's a great quote that you have that kicks off everything here, and the context of this is our sister province, Ontario, just over to the east of us, directly east of us, increased their minimum wage to $15 an hour. And there was huge outcry and a lot of controversy over that, and CBC News has an article about it, and we're going to pull out this particular quote from this article, and the link to that article so you can read it will be on our website, fixingtheworld.ca. There are many theories as people you're going to talk to, but there's nothing written down that says minimum wage of what minimum wage should be. For example, the anchor concept for how does the least paid worker by law relate to the average or median?
Yeah, so there's and the problem here, of course, it lies in the what's minimum wages. We argue with one person who has a different idea of what minimum wage is or what it should be based on, and you can go everywhere from whichever measure you use, for anything from $5 to $15 to $20 an hour, even more. I think some people I was hearing a while back were saying like $20 or $30 an hour.
If that's the case, I'm still not making minimum wage.
Indeed.
At $30 an hour.
There are very few of us that are, unfortunately. And so, yeah, I mean, this is a political hot button, right? So this is one of those things that politicians like to harp on. They they'll demonize the poor and the workers, or they'll demonize the businesses, and whether one or both of those things is true or not, it just drives votes, or it scares people away from one party to another. But it really isn't a political issue in that respect. It is an economic one that affects many people. for every week. I mean, every week or every 2 weeks, every payday that affects people. And it's
Yeah, depending on what your pay structure
Yeah.
is. Yeah, it could be every 2 weeks or
And-
every 15 days.
yeah, and it could be, and it absolutely does affect everybody up the food chain, if you excuse the expression. But the people in the middle, their wages are driven by the lowest wages, or driven up or down accordingly. So it's something that is very, it's economic, it's social, but those politicians that no one trusts anymore, if they ever did, use it as a carrot and a stick, or just a stick to whip people with.
Mhm. And something that with our little snafu that happened previously, the point that I had making is that at a federal level, it becomes one of those things that attracts people to the party. We're gonna fight for workers' rights, and we support this. And then they get into office and they say, "Oh well, it doesn't really fit," or "We're gonna legislate it so that it's up to the province to delegate and set your minimum wages as it is." And then the province comes back and says, "Well, we really don't have a lot of resources or enough resources to police this, so we're just gonna have to trust that you, the business, are gonna do what's fair and equitable for your workers. Otherwise, the theory is that you won't have any workers." Well, if you're desperate enough to work for a job that's going to pay you garbage, that probably means you need to work. In fact, I don't know many people who don't need to work. We all need some kind of income coming in. So that theorem only makes sense if there's a multitude of jobs to choose from. If I have multiple minimum wage jobs, then I don't have a problem. This guy's going to treat me like garbage, or is going to pay a little bit exactly minimum wage. This next guy's going to pay me 50 cents more. Well, I can go to him. But in the current economic situation, a lot of the part-time jobs aren't are just minimum wage based. So it's the same problems, it's the same issues, just at a different workworkplace.
Yeah, I mean, think about what regardless of how we define minimum wage, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that in a second. But it's something that's pretty much on television every time there's an election. Every time someone is looking for votes, someone's looking to fearmonger and scare about an economic downturn, and so on and so forth. But minimum wage actually hasn't been with us that long, relatively speaking. In Canada, Manitoba was the first province to have a minimum wage, and that was 1918. And yeah, if we got to go back, Australia had it a little earlier, but it took between 1896 and 1907 for it to actually affect everyone before they actually had a real minimum wage right across the board.
Right.
And Canada was battling with it from 1918 to, I didn't make a note of that last date, but years and years and years. In the UK, it started to become an issue in 1909 and didn't actually become right across the board for everybody until 1930. I mean, that's 21 years, man. That's lots. And of course, the US is always leading the way by waiting until 1938.
Yeah. And in fact, interesting. Just an interesting bit of synchronicity. We're recording this on November 12th, so yesterday was Remembrance Day. So in honor of that, I mean, we had the day off, but I watched a bunch of videos pertaining to the Second World War. And interesting fact is that part of the New Deal and the Great Society that was dreamed up by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president at the time, was to combat the idea of joblessness and at the end of the Great Depression. And it kind of dovetailed into the war years because the Great Depression ended and World War II subsequently started very shortly after. So that gave precedence to factory workers who were working for Uncle Sam. So we have a minimum wage that we're going to pay you, but we're doing it because you can sell it. Well, we're going to pay you the minimum so that our boys can fight and mask it with patriotism. But there was definitely some abuse there. But it's interesting that in that time, that's really the heyday for unions and equal pay or better pay. If you look at a lot of times when these are adopted, the minimum ages, 1909 in the UK, 1896, even into 1918, these are like considered to be the Industrial Revolution years. This is the years that industry just took off, and that was the big revolution that was there. And the most important thing is till they started legislating this, people were actually dying at work. So,
Well, for sure.
um,
Actually, I'm just to kind of clarify there a little bit. This was kind of the those dates, those years, actually signify the end of decades, if not generations, of people coming off the fields to come and work in towns and cities and work in factories. And that was in itself was a result of hundreds of years of deregulating the farmlands. There's a move away from feudalism towards what we now see as capitalism. It's a small group of people owning the means of production, and of course then people have to go to those individuals to look for wages rather than growing their own crops and so on. And so, but it got to that point where they were sending 5-year-old children up chimneys to clean them. And this is like something. It was right out of a Dickens novel. It was right out of
something we regard today as like this would never happen in our country, but it did happen in our country. It was happening in our country.
It sounds like something out of a Dickens novel. That's because Dickens was actually writing about life as it was in the 1800s in England. Yeah. That's really what it was like.
In the Industrial Revolution, right? So
we've got a whole load of just nasty just working conditions, the life for a lot of people that were working in the factories. You'd have 2 or 3 families in a little 1 or 2 room apartment in the basement of some dank building underneath or very, very close to the factory that they worked. Life wasn't great in the towns.
And let's not forget, like, even just exposure to things like soot and carbon-based things like chimney sweeps and stuff like that have a short lifespan, not only just because the work is dangerous, but because you are exposed to a lot of deadly chemicals. That all of a sudden it's like, well, okay, well, these people are dying quick, but there was such abject poverty. There's another guy who will replace them because they need the pennies. Right, so
so when we're looking at a market-driven economy, which has been going for probably a good 100 years or more, and it's when the market is the way that you regulate things, it's going to go to where the power is. Right, and the power is where the money is, as usual, where the wealth is, and whoever's controlling that is the one that will decide, make the decisions. And of course then it's not in their best interest to pay anyone any more than they absolutely have to. Now it's also worth mentioning around that time as well, right? I mean, you mentioned it was an unhealthy place to it was unhealthy, people were dying. A lot of the laws that govern the workplace started to take shape around that time as well. This didn't happen in a vacuum, and it didn't happen all on its own. Time off.
You start to see the progression, right? And we'd have to double check this. In fact, I'll look it up now because we can do these things.
Yep.
I'm going to check the dates of the Winnipeg general strike. I believe that's close to that 1918 date in Manitoba. So let me check this real quick.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's when people start hurting is kind of when change kind of happens, because then they start to pressure the politicians, and that's kind of what was going on, right? We're kind of seeing it around the world even today. We've got Turkey and Chile and a whole lot of other places. France has been in riots for about 10 months now, all battling because the living conditions are getting worse and worse for the working people, and not just we're not just talking about the working class, but the middle classes as well. To the point where the point where the middle class and the working class are almost indistinguishable now.
Okay, so the Winnipeg General Strike was actually in 1919, so a year after the there's a lot going on here, so excuse me if I'm a little distracted. That's a whole year after the minimum wage was introduced. So I'm guessing that it was introduced, but nobody really took it seriously, and there was enough people here that said, hey, we're gonna start not doing the work that you want, because you're literally working us to death.
Yeah.
And so this would be post First World War. Canada's involvement in the First World War was like immediate because of our immediate ties to Britain. We still hadn't fully separated as a nation from the Commonwealth and become completely independent. So that meant when Britain went to war, we were right in there with them. So a relatively small nation compared to its landmass is now included into one of the, up until that point, the biggest war the world had seen. So
well, the war to end
we
all wars.
obviously taxed ourselves, right, to the point where we're having to recover. So that that led into a lot of factory work and trying to rebuild, and now trying to take advantage of this increased production. But if you're not going to pay your people properly and you're not going to provide them with proper working conditions, either people will die or they'll dig in their heels and say, no, let's make this better. And we dug in our heels and made it better.
Yeah.
So
supposedly. And when people get desperate, they start to organize, and these were the first times it happened. I mean, it's happened right through feudalism as well. There'll be uprisings, but in the world where the king's word was law, people were just pretty much executed, and there was no way, even though it would have been illegal, even when it did happen in England, there was no one really there to prosecute the king or prosecute the lords. The people were kind of powerless. They were kind of around, the ringleaders were rounded up and executed. Definitely something worth maybe looking at for another show, but
yeah. Well, and I think the important thing to note as well is with minimum wage, that as much as we're saying it's not a political issue, it kind of is and it kind of isn't. It is a gray area. And so,
I didn't say that it wasn't a political issue. That wasn't what I meant.
Right.
Is that yes, politicians use it, and therefore it is a political issue, and politics drive the law. But it's really about the human beings. That was my point.
That's right. And it really does come down to it is when you think is how do you define what qualifies you to have a minimum wage job? And I think one of the things that we had sort of talked about before we realized that we weren't recording was, do we have to have different tiers of minimum wage? Do you look at somebody who's completely unskilled and has no relative work experience and has no, factory training or educational training or higher education that they can commoditize
commoditize.
I think commodity. Yeah, sure.
I think you're. I think you're right. Yeah.
But they can use that as a commodity to sell themselves. Does that mean that they have a certain tier of minimum wage and they can reach this bracket, and then as soon as they become skilled, now this is the minimum wage for this is? You can certainly see that in things like Apprenticeship Canada and Red Seal Trades, that most apprentices make around that $16, $17, $18, $19 an hour, depending on which trade and how specialized you become. And then it goes, and each tier you go up, your wage is supposed to increase according to Apprenticeship Canada. Now, those numbers differ from what is actually being paid, but they're within that sort of realm there. So,
yeah, and it's definitely something that we'll be talking about that and many other possible options. I think maybe start talking about what a definition of a minimum wage is as well. One of the definitions is it's the minimum wage is really enough income for people to stay out of poverty, right? That's one of the definitions. I think a lot of the political parties will use that. They're using something called the Consumer Price Index, and based on that, and that's based on the average price of food and services and dwellings and everything else. And then they come up with, based on that, how much someone would have to make a year to have a roof over their heads of some description, eat and be clothed, be able to get to work and back. So we're looking at now in Canada, I think, or in Manitoba, I think we're looking at about $12 to $13 according to the Consumer Price Index. I have to look up to get the exact number, but it's something along those lines.
Sounds about right. Now, my question with that though is, and that's a good sort of baseline, but I think one thing that also has to, well, I guess it is kind of factored in there because they're talking about, we particularly talked about food, but housing and and decisions about how you're going to live and where you're going to live often are one of the most important things that you're going to factor your wage around, because if you if you're a homeowner, you own a house, you have some pretty steep obligations that you have to make your mortgage and your gas payment and your water bill and all those things that just come with owning the house. All the money you pay out just to be in the house. Forget about food and clothes. You just have to pay for the house. Now, if you don't have that, does that mean that they have the right to not pay you as much? What if you're a very skilled person, but you decide to live in a you don't have a family, you're just a single person, but you're extremely skilled, extremely smart, and extremely intelligent, but you choose to live in a bachelor pad, a 600 square foot bachelor pad where the kitchen and the living room are the same, and the all that is exactly 100% the same room except for the bathroom in the corner. Should your wage decrease because your expenditures are out? I mean, we haven't taken into those factors. What if you decide, instead of, I might be in a position where I could own a car, but I just choose not to.
Right, but
Right.
I mean, if you're going to make those kinds of arguments, and you're quite right to make those arguments, that's definitely worth talking about. But then we could make other arguments as well. Why is someone then getting paid more for the same time and the same amount of effort, regardless of skill? And again, that's an argument or a discussion we are going to have in later shows for sure. For me, I would come out at the value of the work being done as opposed to the price that the market will let you get away with paying for that work.
Agreed.
So
The valuation, but how do you? The question then is, how do you calculate that value?
Yeah.
Um,
and that is something we
just,
would definitely be talking about.
Yeah. So again, we've sort of touched on it here as sort of precursors.
Yep.
Oh, there we go. We're at the 20-minute mark.
So much for the science alarm.
Yeah. Whoops. Yeah, I'm sure everybody heard that beep, 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 beep. We're trying to keep these a little bit more structured than our other show, The Invisible Man, which is comes out at least a couple of times a week. You should check it out.
A couple times a month? You mean a month? The Invisible Man.
A couple times a week.
Invisibleman.ca. Check us out if you're into independent music. We are.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Very
So
much.
I think that that's probably not a bad place to actually leave it there anyway. We are going to be back with part 2. For us, it'll be seconds. For you, it'll probably be another week. We're actually going to be talking about the general arguments for and against minimum wage. But I think for now, that's good. We'll probably end up in the next show just recapping a definition that we can work with for what minimum wage ought to be, I suppose. And then we'll move on from there with the arguments. So any last words, Ryan?
No, I think I was just going to bring it into land here. Say thanks to everybody for joining us and letting us be a part of your day. You can check us out at fixingtheworld.ca and on all your major podcasts. And if you are feeling so inclined and want to hear us talk about music and decide that you like our buttery voices,
Indeed,
come check out The Invisible Man at theinvisibleman.ca. Also, we are on Facebook under It's All in the Mind. Is the band page. Come check us out. Post on there regularly when we have our show. And until next time, thanks everybody. This has been Mark Stollard and Ryan Jantz. Thanks for joining.
Thank you much. And yeah, that's been a pleasure. Thank you. So.
He's gonna